Yeah, I think it's time to move on. I think it's time for us to go forward in life, forget some of the miseries that happen in our lives, and just try to move on. The world has moved on. Us personally must move on as well. So, I don't want to do this because it's hurting me emotionally, but I have to because I am going to be part of the moving on crowd. He'll be missed. Definitely. Let's see. Yeah, I think I think that suits the review. Okay, Hot Shots, both films. The first one and part deux, or whatever, or however you want to pronounce it. Now, both of these films has been directed by Jim Abrahams, who's a director that I definitely think is a pioneer in comedy. He basically kind of started the whole spoof genre with Hot Shots, with airplanes, with Naked Gun. His films are very over the top. Over the top. They take the idea of anarchistic comedy and just go all the way. They don't really care about any sort of limitation in comedy. If they think it's possible to put on film, they're gonna do it. And usually they work. For most people. This is why his films are usually very critically acclaimed and still are considered as some of the best comedy movies ever made. Airplane is considered as one of the greatest movies ever made, period. And I hate to say it, but he's one of those directors who I think I respect him more than I like him. I respect Airplane for his audacity to just break limitations in comedy. I personally just don't really get into his comedy as much so as some of the other folk in the film community. Obviously, a lot of people love him. I like his films. That's about it. And Hot Shots is not as good as Airplanes, but it's not bad either. I think they're okay. So let's really get into the films. The first film is simple. It's obviously a very direct spoof of Top Gun, but they don't just do a back to back, copy of the film. They kind of put their own taste into it. They make the storylines of Top Gun and just make them into jokes or just make totally different stuff happen all the way. Jim Abrahams knew one thing, that the scary movies or the superhero movie or the fucking Meet the Spartan films or those terrible spoof movies didn't get. What he knew was that he did not need to lower his humor, and he did not need to just take the original story of the source material that he's getting for this film, and he knew that he didn't need to just copy the story. The plot is all you need. The story is your own, and you can make a film with a totally different story with the same plot. It can still work as a spoof. And I think the Hot Shots films are a great example of that. And I think what really helps the comedy is the acting. Valeria Golino and Charlie Sheen has one of the best chemistries I have ever seen in any comedy film ever. And I think this is why their humor works. It's not that they act funny, it's that they lack reactions. And this is, intentional. When something absurd goes on, when they're inflicted pain, when something absolutely absurd just happens, they stay calm. They don't break the mood. They just keep acting seriously, as if this is a real drama. And what makes this so funny is the lack of a reaction. I think when comedy happens is usually two things. When the most basic form of comedy is usually it involves pain, and pain inflicted on a certain person. Now, this is how a comedy can work when it comes to pain. When somebody is inflicted with pain, you can do two things. One, you can show how much this pain has affected this person. He can react violently, he can die, whatever happens, it could be funny. Obviously, Tom and Jerry cartoons are a great example of that. The other way is to just show a total lack, a total absence of a reaction, and it will still be funny because it's such a strong contrast. And when you have two actors who are doing such a good job of that, it's just amazing to watch. Their chemistry, their seriousness together is so strong that it contrasts perfectly with the absurdness of the movie, and it's not awkward. It works perfectly well. It's really funny, and it works that they're both really good actors as well. And if anything, I feel like there's a nice balance between visual humor and dialogue-driven humor. Like a lot of sight gags happen in this movie, and obviously we notice them, we laugh, but then they would just kind of really get into this one joke they've been building up the whole time, and it's about this character named Dead Meat. So obviously we know he's gonna die, and they use every single visual gag you can think of and more to tell you, just kind of foreshadow. They're just covering up the camera and saying he's gonna fucking die. Even his wife shows up, and all she's talking about is basically kind of foreshadowing his death. But the buildup is so over the top and so dialogue driven at times that you just kind of can't help but laugh at it, even though you know what the intention is. And I think that's a great example of the strength of this film. It's not all visual humor. It's not all just absurd sight gags. They use dialogue to make the situation more absurd. There's a good balance there, and I think that's why the first film is a 3 out of 4, and I also think that's why the first film is better than the second one. And here's the thing. The second one has most of the strengths of the first one. If anything, it's more ambitious in its settings, in its effects, in its, plot. And it's not simply just an air-based plot. There's so much more going on here. There's a war, there's a dictator, there's a president. The general from the first film is now a president, which is funny in itself because the general character is absolutely genius. He's just a guy whose his body is basically made of certain materials that is not skin, and his character is so over the top. He's easily the best character in the whole film. So basically all of this is happening in the second film. So you would think that the second movie would be better. But here's my problem with it. I think that it's way too pop culture driven. And I think that's what makes the disaster movie, epic movie kind of become failures. To me, pop culture jokes can work once in a while, but in this film, there's such an overabundance of it that at the end, when they're just spoofing Star Wars, you're not really laughing. You're just kind of staring at it and say, "Oh, Star Wars, of course, I know what that is." And at first, you're like, "Oh, I know what that is," but as the movie goes on and when the jokes just get tiring, you just kind of don't have a reaction to them. It feels like they lack originality. Because the film itself is obviously already, kind of parodying Rambo in a certain way, and Apocalypse Now, and a lot of other things. And also it lacks a balance between sight gags and dialogue-driven humor. There are a few moments where the dialogue is funny, but it's mostly visual humor. The dialogue humor is very sparse, and I think that's really what makes this film weaker than the first one. It lacks a balance. So it is a 2.5 out of 4 for me, but I would still recommend watching both of them. They're funny in their own way. I think they're effective. They're not totally for me, but the first one still is funny, and I can see how people can still laugh at the second one. So yeah, Jim Abrams is still a person that I admire. I might not like his movies as much as you do, or some other people, but hey, these films are decent. I can definitely say that. So yeah, Hot Shots Part 2, 3, 2.5, bye.